Okay, so in step one, the first thing that you're going to want to do is define what your learning pod is. And you might be asking yourself, like, okay, well, what exactly is a pod? Because I've been in the Facebook groups, I've been reading Parent Magazine, there's all these different definitions about what these pandemic pods are. So the most common types of pods that we're going to go over just briefly right now is number one is a home learning pod. And a home learning pod is what we're going to be describing for the rest of this webinar. But essentially a home learning pod is where your children remained enrolled in their school and they supplement the provided online material that they're getting with an in-person instructor that you're going to hire. And that educator is there to enrich and extend the curriculum that's been provided by the school. Now, a micro school is a little bit different because the children are not enrolled in the school. So they are pursuing an alternative curriculum, and it's not meant to supplement. The educator that you hire is creating their own curriculum, and dependent on the state that you're living in, it may require a formal license. And then the third is a co-op pod, which is very similar to a home learning pod, except that there's no educator hired. It's mostly being done through parents, and they're kind of taking on that burden themselves. Most of the time, parents do not have an educational background. It's just kind of being shared amongst families, and it's just there to kind of support the virtual learning model that exists. Okay, and then you can kind of see the differences in these, but mostly the biggest difference that you'll notice here is that a micro school is not enrolled in your traditional school. And micro schools, they need accreditation from an outside party. And then the curriculum style is a little bit different in these three pods. So the other thing to note here is the length. So usually a home learning pod, the duration is as short or as long as you'd like. Same thing with the co-op pod, but for micro schools, you're usually signing up for an entire school year or a little bit longer. So these home learning pods, co-op pods allow more flexibility, whereas micro schools are a little bit more stringent. The next thing to decide is the specifics of your pod. So you want to consider how many students are going to be in your pod, how many families are going to be in there. You want to also think about the age range within your pods. Are you going to have students from the same grade levels, or are you going to have different grade levels? And when you take into consideration these specifics, you also have to think about that affecting the dynamic of your pod and finding an educator that can handle the different age ranges and abilities. And then finally, for the D, you want to find out the schedule and location of your pod. How often are you going to meet? How many hours a day? And for how long? And then type of instructor. Who are you going to have come into your home and do this? Are you going to hire a tutor, a credentialed teacher, a parent? Those are things that you guys will have to figure out. Budget, of course, is a big one to consider. Many of you are already at home with your kids and you know the type of investment and dedication, and hopefully you've seen by being at home with your kids and doing learning from home, the value of a teacher and how much they've dedicated their career to this profession. So we really want to encourage you to keep that in mind. And if your budget is tight, where can you kind of reduce expenses so that you can prioritize paying an educator a good wage for what they're worth? And to just remember that it is an investment in your child, even though it's a little bit unforecasted, right? You weren't really expecting this, but it is a great investment. The final thing to consider is how you will approach equity and inclusion in your learning pod, and how you might incorporate diversity and inclusion into your curriculum. Now, these are things for you to consider. We don't think there's a right or a wrong way to do this. These are just things for you to consider. Okay, so how to make this work alongside with your school? There's three things that we really want to encourage you to do. And one is to just be straight up and transparent with your school and your educator and let them know that this is how you are solving the virtual learning obstacle that is occurring, and they hopefully will not be angry. Again, we're all in this together. We're just trying to figure out the best way to serve our students and your children. So be transparent with them so that they can help you and they can collaborate with you. And then the next thing is to make sure that you participate as much as possible with your child's virtual learning. You want to maximize the learning time that they have already with the teacher that they're enrolled in online, and to think about your in-person instructor as a supplement, not a replacement to your virtual learning model. And then the last thing is to try and communicate with your teacher and access curriculum ahead of time. Many teachers have a syllabus or they already kind of have a lesson plan for at least the next couple of weeks that if you are communicating and collaborating with them, then everybody can kind of work together to serve your child in the best way possible. And then now I think we have a poll. James is gonna lead us in through another poll. So go ahead, James.
I think that should be coming up now. So the question is, your learning pod is, and then there's a few different options to choose from around how far through the formation of a learning pod you are. So it looks like most people are still being formed across multiple families. Yep, actually that looks like most people that it is being formed across multiple families. A couple of people looking for an educator, which makes a ton of sense. I'm sure that a lot more people will be joining that boat soon as families realize that the school year is about to start again if it hasn't already started. So maybe we'll just let this run for another 5 seconds or so. But yeah, it looks like most of the crowd is still looking for an educator at the moment and is forming their pod across across multiple families. All right, I'm going to end that poll now. And I think Geordie is going to take this section.
And thank you, James. Well, perfect timing. If everyone's looking for a pod, that's what we're going to talk about next. So Tanya's covered off what you need to think about in what you're looking for in a pod. Then you need to go out there and find families that are looking for the same thing as you. There needs to be a little bit of flexibility, certainly, in what you're looking for, because if you are, and we found this with some of the parents that we've been engaging with, they've got an idea and it has been days and weeks that they've been trying to find that same person. So there might be something that you need to sort of be flexible on in your wish list, but certainly start there with your wish list. And where we also suggest you start is with your local school community. That makes the most sense because most importantly, they're most likely to be people that you know and that you trust. And that makes sense if you're going to be obviously podding up and becoming a podster with them and putting your kids in the same space. So that's really important. But aside from that, it's geographically more likely to be beneficial. You can be proximal to each other. You'll have the same curriculum. You might even be in the same classroom. And have kids in the same grade, same classroom. Now, that is a perfect pod of having 4 students, same school, same classroom, same teacher. That is the ideal pod. Doesn't very often come to fruition. So again, having a range of grades is okay. You just need to be wary that that can increase more challenges, but there's no 100% right way to do it. If you find that that's where you look and you can't find some local parents, families, children within your school community, don't worry. As I'm sure you've already found, social media is rife with the pod movement at the moment. So there's plenty of people that are in the same situation. You guys are all in this webinar today for that very reason. So head to social media, Facebook groups. There is some really big ones. And we're going to provide a list of all the resources that you can head to at the end in a follow-up. Facebook groups are a great place to start. Nextdoor is also very popular. And then there's some websites. Podmatch is one we would recommend checking out to go out there and try and connect with some prospective families. When you do connect and you reach out and it's like, yep, you're looking for a pod, I'm looking for a pod, what next? Obviously the logistics are important that Tanya's outlined, but some really other key things that we'd encourage you to consider, to discuss, to ask questions about. First and foremost is the mission and the vision that you want from your pod. Are you a cultural match in terms of parent to parent, student to student? Because if there's friction there and it's not an easy relationship from the start, very likely that might continue and cause some issues down the track. So start there first and foremost. discuss all the logistics, talk about COVID, because that's a very front, and we're going to talk about that in step 4. But be upfront about that. What are your precautions? What are your isolation standards? What are you expecting? Because you want to find out as early as you can if someone's in the same point of view as you. You don't want to put a pod together and then get to the end and you've got completely different expectations. So that's really important. Talking about the length of the pod and what you will do when schools do resume in a hybrid mode. Will it continue? Will it disband? Will you review? These are all things to discuss. Tanya has put together this wonderful resource here, again, that you'll get access to. They're on our website now, actually, but we will send you the PDFs in a follow-up, so you will get access to those afterwards. So we've done 1, 2, and 3. The last step, you found your prospective families, you've asked questions, you've found a match, put together a plan. So how do we move forward? What are our timelines? When is our pod going to start? And work backwards from then. How are we going to find a teacher and where? James is about to sort of talk to you a little bit about that, but we certainly suggest having a clear plan. Again, flexibility is important, but put it down on paper if you can. And we've also seen that pods have been very successful with a pod leader. You can't have too many cooks in the kitchen that are all trying to organise. If you can, have one person take the lead, and that will make the process a bit smoother.
Geordie, we've got a quick question before we go on to the next
Sure.
step. We've got a question from the audience here,
Sure.
which is, what would you consider to be the most efficient and safe process of forming a pod with other families?
The most efficient and safe.
And safe. I think probably the emphasis on safe.
Yeah, definitely. And that comes in that matchmaking part, is to just be open and honest about what your expectations are in safety, in terms of who is in your home. And that's not just the children, it's also what other family members do you have and what are the family members that you're seeing outside of your home. So just being transparent about that is the best way to make a safe pod. And again, in step 4, we'll provide you with some really key things to consider that you can use in the step 2 to make sure that that's something that you're addressing. And there's a lot of little things that you might not have thought about, and it's just a big, broad question. We'll provide you some details and a bit of a deeper dive. So some little things that you might not have considered, and if you keep them in mind and be honest, you'll find somebody that's on the same page.
Great, thanks, Geordie. I'm going to take the next step, step 3, which is about the things to consider when hiring a teacher. This section could be a whole webinar by itself, but I'm not going to get into too much information or go too deep tonight. I'll just say that a lot of this information is really, really important to keep your pod and your family safe. And if you do have more questions about any of the topics that I talk about in the next sort of 5 to 10 minutes, I encourage you to go to our website. There's a resource section that has a lot of the same information, or simply go to our website and schedule a consultation with one of our team members, and we'll be able to go through all of these matters and ideas according to your personal situation, because every pod is different. All right, first couple of things to consider when determining your needs and when hiring a teacher. You want to be setting expectations. So when you are reviewing possible teachers, what are the things that they must have? Must they have 5 or more years teaching at a private school? Maybe you would prefer a public school teacher. Do you definitely want them to have a teaching credential, or is it okay if they've come into teaching from a different background, such as through the private school system? So what are the things that you must have, and what are the things that would be nice to have? That might be bilingual. We would really love to have a teacher who is English, Spanish, bilingual. Get those things, work out those ideas and requirements with your pod members, and that'll make the interview process be a lot more targeted, and you'll be able to get the best possible teacher. Tanya already spoke about budget. This is, if you're considering a learning pod, it's more than likely that was a unplanned, unforecasted expense for the next few months. So think about what your budget is for your learning pod, and just remember that a more experienced teacher or a more qualified teacher will demand a higher investment, a higher salary. And I'm sure just by the nature of you being on this presentation tonight, you would agree that teaching is a really important profession and it deserves to be compensated accordingly. So just remember that as you're thinking about hiring a teacher and setting that wage range. So the way that we see it, there are two main options for hiring an employee, hiring an in-home teacher. You can either hire them directly or you can go through a company. And there's a few companies out there. Scoot at Home is one of them, but there are other good ones as well. Once you've decided which direction you want to go in terms of doing it yourself or using a company, there's a few then subcategories that you need to think about. So if you're hiring a teacher directly, you want to think about, are you going to classify them as a W-2 employee, which would be known as a household employee in this case? Are you going to classify them as a 1099 independent contractor? Or are you going to pay them under the table? You're going to pay them in cash. All those options have pros and cons, and we're going to go through a few of them tonight. And then if you do choose to use a company, I strongly recommend you find out whether that company employs or classifies their teachers as W-2 or 1099. And we'll talk a bit more in a moment about why that difference is important for you as the family and what risk it exposes you to or doesn't. So hiring an in-home teacher, particularly when you're doing it yourself, can get very complicated very quickly. There's a lot of things to consider, but I would recommend you talk to an employment lawyer about how you're going to classify your teacher. If you're thinking about classifying them as an independent contractor, talk to a employment lawyer about Assembly Bill 5. It's been announced that because of Assembly Bill 5, it looks like Uber is stopping operations in California as soon as tomorrow. So AB 5 has really significantly changed when it's legal to classify somebody as a contractor. And it's my expectation, I'm not an employment lawyer, but it's my expectation that an in-home teacher would probably not fit within AB 5. Talk to your accountant about taxes and filings, whether you choose to classify as a contractor or as a household employee. You are going to have taxes to pay and filings to submit. So you do not want to miss those because you can get pretty gnarly fines from the IRS if you miss a filing or don't withhold the right tax or pay the right tax on time. And then finally, if you are doing it yourself, I highly recommend you talk to your insurance broker, most likely whoever you get your household insurance from, because you will need to look at some additional insurances such as workers' compensation insurance, liability insurance for slip and fall. You just don't want to be in a situation where you have a teacher in your home and they slip over on some water and then they get injured. You don't want to be in a situation where you're liable for that, obviously. That'll cause a lot of stress.
James, I'm just going to interrupt you really quickly because I know that parents, this is the part that really stuffs them up and it gets to be really overwhelming and it can be a lot. But I just want to remind all the parents that are listening to this, we're not sharing this to freak you out or to scare you, but it is important that you do know all of the things that you need to do in order to be compliant. So as James goes on to the next couple of slides, do know that we're just wanting you to have all of the information so that you can stay compliant and work out all of these things. So don't be fearful of these next couple of slides. James is definitely trying his best to just educate you. Don't feel like we're trying to scare you. So just keep that in mind, and we are going to provide some ways that you can fix this and avoid these things. So don't freak out and keep listening. All right, go ahead, James.
And, thank you, Tanya. It's a really good point. I promise you I'm not trying to be the boogeyman that lives under your kid's bed. But we just want to make you aware of the different options and the pros and cons. I run a business that has, over 1,000 employees sometimes, and this is the type of thing that keeps me up at night. So I don't want to be too scary. I just want to be informative. Thank you, Tanya. So when you are, obviously you want to, if you're going it alone, you want to advertise, Indeed, Facebook, in Nextdoor, even Craigslist can be good places to advertise for a teacher. Facebook is probably going to be your go-to place to start with. And then you want to go through the same screening and interview process that you would if you were hiring any employee. If you're a business owner or a business manager, you want to put in the same thorough level of vetting because, your kids are going to be spending a lot of time with this person. You want to get to know them before you make a commitment, and to avoid a false start, and just make sure you're doing your reference checks, etc. All right, so what is next? So if you did get a little bit scared, which I'm sorry if that is what happened, if you started to think, or you are thinking, I don't want to worry about the financial, the legal, the risk exposure that can come by having a household employee or an in-home teacher, then there are other options. You can use a company. If it's a good company, what they will do is they will be the employer of the teacher for you. And that means that they will take care of the liability insurance. They will take care of the employment agreements, the taxes, the withholding payments, the annual, the quarterly filings, and all of those things that a business does every single day, but a family doesn't do ever in most cases. So if you choose to use a company, just make sure that they are taking care of all of those elements, and that whether they're classified as a W-2 or 1099 contractor. Jordy, go ahead.
I'll just add on that. Yeah, one thing we would encourage you, because there is Scoot is one of them. There's plenty of companies out there, but just do your research if you choose to go down this path. If you go elsewhere other than Scoot, fine, but just make sure that you've done your background on how long a company has been around, and been doing what they're doing, because there are some companies that are quite new and they might be doing all these things to the letter of the law, but just make sure you check. That's all, because there has been people that have been doing it for a long time, and they, as James said, they do it every single day. Some haven't been doing it for that long, so just make sure that if you use a company, use a good one that knows what they're doing.
Yeah, there's definitely over the last couple of weeks been a sort of a cottage industry pop up around learning pods. So just make sure you do your due diligence. There's good ones and there's less experienced ones out there.
And you also want to ask what service they're actually providing, because a lot of them are not necessarily providing you with all this employment and compliance, but they're just matchmaking you and charging you a finder's fee. So make sure you understand what you're paying for, because that's also really important.
Yeah, that could get you back just to square one. Okay, yeah, and obviously if you use a company, they will do the advertising, the screening, and handle all the templates for you, like the employment agreements, the pod isolation agreement, etc. A few things that are really important if you do choose to go through a company, or even if you do it yourself, some of these is please get a criminal background check. And be aware that all criminal background checks are not the same. If you go through a company, make sure they get a live scan background check, and I'm about to, on the next slide, explain why that's so important. But make sure that happens. You can also check the validity of any teacher in California's credential through the Commission on Teacher Credentialing website. You can do a search just on their name, or if you have their date of birth and social security number, you can do a secured search, which is even better, because that will tell you, it'll tell you for everyone if they have a credential or not. But if you do a secured search, it will also tell you if that person has had their credential suspended, or even revoked. And just we have seen some people like on the Facebook forums and the pod groups say, well, if you can't get a criminal background check, what you can do is go to the CTC website and you can see if they've had their credential revoked. That is a really scary proposition to me because the CTC website, while a good resource of information, is simply not that up to date. It can lag months and months and months in delay. And yeah, like we already mentioned, make sure you're getting your references. Professional references are key when you are choosing an educator. So really quickly want to demonstrate or illustrate how some criminal background checks differ, because it's a really critical component. This person is going to be in your home with your kids, with your family or with your friends' kids. And while you might be home, you're not going to be around in the same room all the time. So we had a situation a few years ago in 2017 where we got a criminal background check from somebody who had applied with us, and it had some reports on it that were worthy of consideration. And I wanted to run an experiment to say, okay, what does our criminal background reports get and see and show versus what does one that you can get over the counter if you just know a person's name and social security number? Sort of the criminal background check that Uber does, for example. And on the left here, you can see the results of a criminal background check, which is just anyone can go online and do this test. You don't need any special permission. And you can see this person has been through the sex offender list, the global watch list, etc. And they had one incident come up on their county search, which was driving with a suspended license. Something that you probably want to be aware of and consider. Now on the right of the screen is what's called a live scan criminal background check. And this is what I really encourage you to insist on, regardless of what company you go through. Private citizens, private individuals or families cannot get access to live scans. Not even individuals can get their own live scan in many cases. So you do have to go through a company for this level of criminal background check. But you can see there that down the bottom on the right, we have the driving while license suspended. So that matches up to the other report we saw. But then you can see above that some more recent but pretty serious reports and convictions that don't appear on the more vanilla, easily accessible criminal background check. And that could be a variety of reasons. It's probably because these crimes were convicted in August and we ran this report in September, so there may be a lag, but I show this to illustrate why it's so important that you get a live scan criminal background check. Okay, thanks, Jordy. So we are coming to the end of this step. A few things to keep in mind and make sure that you have an answer to as you're thinking about how to classify your teacher or whether to use a company. Make sure you have an answer to every one of these points. How are you going to get liability insurance? How are you going to pay or avoid the nanny tax? How are you going to avoid wage and hour lawsuits or incorrect dismissal allegations? The last thing you want is to start with a teacher, work with them for 3 weeks, then decide it's not right for you, it's not the right match, dismiss that person, and then all of a sudden you have a wrongful dismissal or even a discrimination allegation against you. And then you have to fight that through a government organization or through the civil courts. So just make sure you have thought about every single line item here. And do remember that California is an employee-friendly state. So if it goes to the state, they're generally often going to go along with the employee's perspective rather than the employer's. So again, hoping to inform, not scare. And if you do have any specific questions about any of the items we discussed tonight, give us a call, send us an email, schedule a consultation. It's all free. We're here to help. And we can talk about your specific situation in your pod. So we're going to launch our last poll for the evening. So this one is, are you planning to use a company or hire your own teacher directly? So it's so far coming in that people are looks like a few people are going to go through the company. A few people don't know anymore, which wasn't my intention. Just want to make sure you have all the considerations to be aware of. So we'll let this go for another 10 seconds or so, but it doesn't look like most people are planning to go through a company, which is probably, it will generally be the more expensive option in the short term, but you'll be really grateful you did this if an incident occurs. All right, I'm going to finish that poll and we're going to go on to step 4 of our 5 steps.
Thank you, James. So step 4 is we're again. Find pod number. You were talking about safety at that point already. You do consider safety in point 3 when you hire your teacher, whichever way you choose to do so. But then now we're going to have a look at, okay, you've got your teacher. What are you actually going to do in terms of the safety within the pod and outside the pod? So we put together an initial list of things to think about. It is pretty extensive, but it is on the initial, so you can go a little bit further than that. So to make things simple, we've got inside the pod and outside the pod. So when you've got the pod, wherever it may be, PPE, number 1, think about that. Who will be wearing masks? Will it be students and teachers and parents? Or will it be just the adults? Will they wear face shields? Make sure that you're very clear on what the expectations are there. How often will hand sanitisation occur? How often will the space be cleaned? What is everyone's stance on the sharing of food, which is probably a pretty straightforward one in terms of people bringing their own food, but also shared equipment, pens, pencils, especially in an elementary pod, kids are used to sharing a lot of that stuff. So how will you put the relevant precautions in place for that? If you're in a household and there are any potentially dangerous substances, materials, equipment, make sure you obviously try and remove them so they can't be accessed, but make sure the teacher, whoever that may be, is aware of where they are and what they are so that they can be prepared. And one thing to think about is within the pod, what are you going to do, or what in the worst case, the scenario that we don't want to happen, but will happen in some pods inevitably, is somebody develops COVID symptoms, whether that be the teacher, the student, another family member that lives in the household. What happens next? Does that student just not attend the pod and it goes on until, or does the pod just have a break until everyone's been cleared? They're important things to think about. Outside of the pod, have a chat and make sure you've got a firm agreement on what people are doing, who they're seeing, where they're going, but just as importantly, who they're not seeing and where they're not going, and what measures they're taking to reduce exposure. So we've got a few examples here of things to have a think about. The beach, is that acceptable? And everyone has a different level of risk in the way they're living, so it's okay. But again, that's why we encourage, back to the question that was at the start, how do we form a safe pod? Have these conversations initially to make sure that you're on the same page. Isolation bubble agreements. So this is another great free resource that Tanya's put together. Tanya, that basically outlines all of the things plus a little bit more and puts it in a format that's really easy. You can select which options you both agree to. And that can be, we have one of these, the one that we're looking at there is an educator to pod agreement, but we also have family to family agreements within a pod that you can use and utilize as well. These aren't legally binding documents, but they are agreements that you certainly put your name to, so that you feel more comfortable in what you're doing is safe and is reducing the risk to whatever standard you want to be. So again, they'll come, they're on our website, but you'll get these resources to follow up, and use these, share these with your friends. They're out, we've created them not just for families that are coming through Scoop. We want this to be a resource. So if you know someone else that's not on this webinar tonight, share it with them. If they're at that stage where they've already secured a teacher and that's why they didn't want to come on the webinar because it wasn't relevant to them, share this with them because they'll get benefit out of that, we hope. Step 5, back to you, Tanya.
Yeah, I think step 4 is the hardest one for parents, is trying to get that safety component in. So using that worksheet has been super helpful for many of our parents, and a lot of the Facebook groups, the discussions that we're seeing is that you guys are trying to navigate that COVID part of it, I think, like we all are. So the final step that we have here is to establish a pod routine. And in doing that, the first thing that you want to do is to create a schedule. And you're going to want to collaborate with not only your teacher and not only the fellow pod parents, but also your kids. Ask them what they're looking forward to in this new home learning environment, what kind of things maybe that they aren't able to do in the normal school environment that you can now do at home. Step 2 is to maintain consistency. As we know, children do really well with consistency and with healthy boundaries. So making sure that you have a level of consistency and routine, especially for younger children. Keep things moving and kind of put things into segments or chunk learning to maximize their engagement. And then the third thing is to make it fun. Think outside the box. Like I mentioned a little bit earlier, a pod really allows you flexibility in the learning environment, and it's really an opportunity for innovation and creativity. So for example, if you're trying to teach history, instead of taking out a textbook and reading it and kind of doing the boring old stuff, you can take their toys and mimic that scene in history and teach them hands-on with toys and creativity and imagination, and having them think outside the box. What that will do for their brain and their learning capacity is just incredible and such a great opportunity. So utilize the space, your outdoor space, your neighborhood. Just kind of think about how you're going to create a schedule using these new opportunities. And then here we have an example of a schedule. This is just kind of to give you some inspiration. As you can see, there is some sort of themes. It looks like Monday and Tuesday, they've got school at the same time. And then Wednesdays they've got a focus on wellness. And then Friday has a group activity. So there is a theme and a routine here that you can follow and give them that structure that they want. And then the next thing is to consider the type of academic enrichment you are going to provide. So consider the following areas that you can include or focus on. This is not an exhaustive list by any means. If you want to just focus on one in particular, just make that known to whoever you're hiring. But you want to consider some social emotional learning. Reading and writing and math is important, but also having your students interact with one another is also very important. Considering diversity education, you can use this to highlight different historical events and figures that they might not be learning in their normal school curriculum. So you can pull from YouTube, or there's plenty of resources that we'll share with you later on that you can pull from that really helps and is great in this category. The third thing is play-based learning. I mentioned this a little bit earlier with the history example, but there's so many things that you can do with fun and with play and incorporating that into their learning. And then the fourth is to consider physical and mental wellness. You can include meditation, yoga, mindfulness, physical activity, exercise, things like that. You can really enrich your experience at home. And then the last thing that you want to do as part of step 5 is to review and recalibrate. You're going to want to be communicating a lot with your pod families because things are changing and it's dynamic, and you may not always see a problem in real time, but retrospectively you might go, that didn't really work so well for us. How can we change and adapt moving forward so that we can really maximize the potential of this pod? So we recommend having regular meetings with your pod, and having a pod leader and having pod positions inside of a pod really helps to facilitate these meetings and to kind of make sure that amongst your busy schedule and lifestyle that you're incorporating these meetings and kind of planning them out. And then the second thing that we recommend is to collaborate and learn from other pods. You know, using social media for this is great to hear what other families are doing and learning from one another's mistakes and one another's successes. So those are the two things that you really want to do to review and recalibrate. And then finally, we've got some resources for you guys to check out. We will be emailing this PDF later on, but there's a variety of curriculum tools for you to use, Facebook groups, miscellaneous tools for you to create worksheets and download, and all kinds of really cool techie things that I wish I had when I was in school. But one thing I do want to mention is that you want to consider having some local vendors. So you're probably going to need a local printing store unless you have a really great printer, because you are probably going to be printing a lot of worksheets and a lot of paper goods. And then another thing is to locate your local teacher supply store so you can get, you know, classroom decorations and supplies. But I've seen Walmart, Target, Staples, Office Depot also have really great resources right now that are for home learning pods, and they're selling them in like Costco size packets. You can get like 120 markers. So those are some great places to check out. Next, we have some home learning inspo for you to check out. So this is inspiration. Don't get freaked out if you've just got a kitchen table, but if you are looking to kind of repurpose a space, on the left-hand side, this family took the dad's man cave and repurposed it for a home learning pod location, and decorated it really beautifully. On the right, this family said, we're putting y'all in the garage, and they just utilized what they had in the garage there, and went to the dollar store, went to the teacher supply store, and just put some things up to make it work. So you can make it functional and make it work with whatever space you want with just a little bit of creativity. Next here, we've got a living room on your left-hand side, transformed using IKEA furniture and just really trying to make use of every little nook and cranny. A lot of the storage supplies are from IKEA, a lot of the furniture is from IKEA, but just to give you an example of like what you can do in your own living room. On the right-hand side, most of that is from Target and IKEA, and is targeted more for like a preschool or elementary school age group. But just to give you some ideas, it doesn't have to be complicated. We recommend having clean spaces that allow for creativity. You want to remove a lot of clutter because it can make, they're indoors all day. So you want to remove a lot of clutter and just make it an environment for learning that's open. And then I think we're going to now talk to you a little bit about our Scoot at Home service.
Yes, thanks, Tanya. And just from a teacher's perspective, and to go back to everything in Tanya, that can be overwhelming. James's slide could be overwhelming from a legal and accounting point of view. Actually, what are we doing in our pod is also very overwhelming. So think about these things, but be confident that the teacher that's coming in, they'll have their own ideas as well, and you can really just jump and piggyback onto what they've got and just put in your little 2 bobs worth, but they'll already have their own style. They'll have their own strengths. But the one thing I would really encourage you to do as a former teacher, and when you're looking at virtual learning and pod learning, is make sure that you're making the most of the in-person, the academic stuff and the enrichment. It is important, but that's what the virtual learning is for. So all that interaction, that play-based learning, getting outside, that activity, try and really maximize that whilst you have a teacher there that can facilitate it for you, because that's what's missing. So make sure you really try and capitalize on that. Scoot at Home, as James said, we're not going to spend too much time on that, but it's really simple how it works if you are interested, and we'll talk, and we do have a little discount we'll talk about in a moment if you are interested in reaching out to us this week. If you're interested, we'll schedule a free consultation with you. We'll get to know what your pod makeup is, what you're looking for a teacher, and do all that, answer any extra questions that you've got on top of tonight. We'll go away, we'll tap into our networks, reach out to people we believe are suitable, and present them to you, up to 3 teachers, that you will have their profile, their background, we'll talk about their personality, and then you can make the decision of, it's your choice. So you interview at the end of the day, and you can do that virtually and in person. If you choose a teacher, then we help with everything from that point. So a lot of the contracts and agreements that you've seen tonight, we will help you facilitate those to make sure that your pod is ready and everyone knows what it looks like on day one. Here's a quick little example of what a teacher presentation will look like on another Zoom call just like this with your pod leader or your pod families. You might have a look at 3 of these and decide who you want to meet with, for example. And then finally, the benefits, just to sum up, the benefits that we really believe in the Scoot at Home service that we do offer. One is from a safety point of view that we can provide all these agreements to make sure it's safe, but you get a really quality vetted teacher that provides a much better and interactive experience for your kids. They're engaged in their learning. They're still doing the socio-emotional on top of the academic. Plus, Scoot's taking a lot off your plate in terms of the liability and all that, the payroll. So we hope that ends up with happy parents, happy teachers, and most importantly, happy children, happy students. So as a thank you for making it through to the end, and we've only got Q&A to go, the discount that we do have available, if you want to take us up, is if you submit an inquiry before the end of the day Friday this week, you'll have half price off your first pod day should you end up with a Scoot teacher facilitating your pod.
Hey, Jordy, what's the best way if I'm interested as a parent, I want to sign up for this? What's the best way to get in touch with us?
Great question. So you can reply. James is going to send an email tomorrow, so you can reply to that. Otherwise, you can head to our website, which is www.scootathome.com. And right there, submit an inquiry. It'll take you down just to put in your contact details as well as a little bit of information about anything that we might want to know. And then one of our consultant team will reach out to you within 24 hours to schedule that first initial and free consultation, and we'll take it from there. So either respond to James or head to our website. Q&A. James.
Yeah. Thank you, Jordy. Thank you, Tanya. So we have had a couple of questions that we've been going through. So we have a first question here. What does one pod day cost? So generally, we want to make sure that as many people have access to a pod teacher as possible. But sort of our default charge is that if it's with students between or in kindergarten up to grade 6, then it's $349 a day. And that includes the teacher being in person for 5 hours and plus 1 hour of prep time for the teacher so that they can go through lesson plans, prepare exercises, etc. And now if you want more hours or fewer hours or bigger pod or smaller pod, that's the type of thing we go through in a consultation to make sure we tailor an option that is affordable for your pod.
So just to make that clear, it's $349 a day if you have students from kindergarten to 6th grade. And then if you have students from grade 7 to grade 12, it's $399 a day. And that includes up to 8 students and a maximum of 3 families. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah, that's our recommendation. Is we recommend that K through 6 pods are no more than 6 students from up to 3 families, while 7 to grade 12 pods we recommend can be as large as 8 students, still from 3 families. And those types of things are flexible, but that's our recommendation as a starting point.
Yeah, we do have.
And then if you do make a long-term commitment to the teacher, so you have them for a few months, we do provide some discounts for that long-term commitment.
One question we've gotten a lot is around the teacher itself. Now, do teachers become part of multiple pods, or are they just sticking to one family? What are kind of the rules around dating other people, if you will, in a dating term? How does that work?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and one that we get all the time. It's in almost all cases, it is a exclusive relationship. So almost always one teacher is only going to one pod. And that's where some of the resources that Tanya and Jordy spoke about, I think in step 4, is really important. So before your first day of your pod, you need to get together with your other pod families as well as your pod teacher. And you need to go through the things that are acceptable and what are not acceptable. So are we okay with members of the pod going to grocery stores? If we are, then are we saying that they always have to be wearing masks when they're outside? These are the types of questions that it really benefits to answer before the pod starts. And we do have a resource which will get emailed to you tomorrow, which sort of makes that a really easy exercise to get all of the pod participants on the same page. Because no two pods are the same, and we're not the police. We can't say what can and can't be done. We just have recommendations, and the best recommendation is that everyone follows the same rules and boundaries. Okay, we haven't had too many questions. It is getting late though, so I think we'll wrap it up there. As mentioned, I will be emailing all of you tomorrow with the presentation, with some resources. Feel free to reply to that email or go to our website and schedule a consultation. If you're interested in using our services, that's great. If you just want to talk about your pod and what you're worried about, make it sort of like a quasi-therapy session, we're here for you as well. So we've seen everything by now. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for attending, and sleep well. Good night.
See everybody.
Hi guys, thank you.